in order for us to live in a free society, something that I think we all would agree is one of the most important things in life, there needs to be space for diversity of experience and thus opinions. Welcome back to another episode of the Nomad's Notebook. My name is Joe Maxwell, and today we're going to be talking about disagreement and explore the reasons why, as a species, we just can't seem to get along. We'll talk about my recent run-in with a police officer, how our unique life experiences shape our opinions, a disagreement that I had while traveling, why it's essential to be in a system that rewards your efforts, the fundamental problem with universal basic income, and an ancient Middle Eastern parable that shows the importance of diversity. A few days ago, I was driving to my parents' house for the Christmas holidays. Now, they live on an island in Lake Huron called Manitoulin. For those of you who aren't familiar with that place, it's directly north of the state of Michigan, to give you a little bit of context. I'll actually say this, I will be absolutely shocked if anyone who's not a family member or a close friend of mine listening to this right now has actually heard of Manitoulin Island. Please let me know if you have. I live in a town right now of about 10,000 people called Port Elgin, Ontario. Now, it's directly south of Manitoulin Island and about 3 hours or so north of the city of Detroit. In the summertime, there's actually a ferry that will run between my parents' island and the mainland that will cut my travel time down to about half from where I live. But come winter, that just isn't an option, obviously. The ferry's not running. So it's about a 7-hour trip driving around Lake Huron and eventually crossing over a swing bridge on the other side of the island. So I had a lot of quiet time ahead of me before this drive. I finished up work on Friday. I had a podcast to record that night, so I opted to do that and then wake up early on Saturday and head out then. There's something incredibly peaceful about driving alone, especially early in the morning when it's still dark and there's nobody else on the road. I'll usually put on an audiobook or just sit in silence and see what thoughts come and go. As I was getting towards the end of my trip, I was passing through a small northern Ontario town where the speed limit drastically turns from 100 to 60 kilometers per hour. Now, for my American listeners, that probably sounds like gibberish. It's about 60 and 35 miles per hour. Now, this is a notorious speed trap, so I was very careful to get my speed down as I was entering this community. As I was coming towards the edge of town, I was getting ready to speed up again, get up to highway speeds, and I see this black Dodge Charger in the distance. It wasn't labeled or anything, but I figured correctly, almost immediately, that it was a cop car. As I approached closer with an extra eye on my speed, because I didn't want to get pulled over, I see this Charger pull a very illegal U-turn right on the highway. It was very dangerous, at least from my perspective, and then he ripped back towards town. He was going at least 120 in what was still a 60 zone. He didn't have any sirens on or anything. I suppose he could have been heading to some kind of emergency, but he probably would have had sirens on if that were the case. So in my head, I just assumed that he wanted to get home a little bit faster. And being a cop, he didn't have to worry about being pulled over in that location like anyone else would. The moment I saw that, I felt this immediate thought that cops are assholes. Now, it was a knee-jerk reaction, but after I had the thought, I pondered it for a while as I continued to drive, and I wondered how I had come to that conclusion. I thought back to a few recent experiences that had a big impact on me. Within the last 3 months or so, I've been given 2 speeding tickets. The first one, I was on my way home from the airport after my flight was very delayed. It was about 2 a.m. and I had to work the next day, so I was really eager to get home and get just a few hours of sleep before I had to wake up at 6 and go on to work. As I was getting into the outskirts of my town, the officer caught me going a reported 140 in an 80 zone. I knew I was going fast, but I was definitely surprised how fast I was actually going. And I wonder if sometimes they exaggerate that too when they pull you over just for shock value. I don't know. Anyway, I was going fast enough, apparently, to receive a stunt driving charge that would cause me to lose my license and my vehicle for 30 days. And on top of that, I usually drive a company vehicle, and I was at that time, so that was definitely a scary prospect. But she was a nice person, and seeing as it was my first ticket ever, she dropped the severity of the charge, and I was left with a $350 bill and no other repercussions. So I left that experience feeling more annoyed with myself than anything else, and thankful that that officer had been so lenient with me. A few weeks later, I was driving to a client meeting for work. Now, I was a little behind schedule, so I was probably in a bit of a rush. After you've had your license for a while, you probably know what I'm talking about. You get to a point just instinctively where you adjust your speed depending on whether you're on a highway or a small town road. So I'm driving down what I assume is a highway. I figure it's an 80 zone, but there were a few houses around, so just instinctively I was going a little slower, maybe 65 or so. Then I happen to look in my rear view mirror and I feel a shot of anxiety in my stomach. My palms become soaked with sweat and my heartbeat races, and I see that all too familiar blue and red flicker as a police cruiser rapidly approaches my bumper. I pull over, and the officer very proudly informs me that I was going 65 in what was in fact a 50 zone, and he was going to have to give me a ticket for that. I told him, I pleaded with him, I was late for a client meeting already, but he held firm, and 20 minutes later, he docked me $80. Now, like with the first ticket, I left that interaction feeling quite annoyed, but it wasn't so much with myself this time. I'll be the first to admit I should have been aware that this highway-looking stretch of road was not in fact an 80 zone, and I'll certainly never make that same mistake again. I also should have left the office earlier so that I wasn't in such a rush, and then maybe naturally I would have just been going a little bit slower. But I was only going 15 kilometers over the limit, which in my mind is not really posing a huge risk to the people around me. And in addition to that, the vibe I got from this officer was that he was truly enjoying this interaction, knowing that he held power over me. That experience really had a big impact on me, and I was left with this thought, this assurance that some people do get into law enforcement for the wrong reasons. They get in because they want to exercise control and power over people in a way where they just can't be ignored. Because if a police officer pulls you over, you have to comply with them or you're going to be in serious legal trouble. You'll probably go to prison, and no one wants that. This desire for control over others is a universal aspect of the human character. If we look back at all of the atrocities that have been committed through history, particularly those in the last, say, 150 years or so, they all come back to this sick desire for control. With that said, I also believe that plenty of people do get into law enforcement for the right reasons, mainly to protect society from danger. I'm not discrediting those people, and in fact, some of them are heroes, and I can attest to that personally. When I was growing up, my family actually knew a police officer in our hometown very well. We would go over to his house a lot and have small group meetings there. His family went to our same church. He was a dedicated husband and a father, I know that for a fact, and an upstanding member of our community. Now, a few years back, we were all shocked and deeply saddened to hear that he had actually been killed in a shooting. Now, I won't go into too much detail just out of respect for the family, but needless to say, it had a huge impact on me. With the gaping hole that was left in our hometown in the wake of this event, I realized that he was a very good and noble man. I tell these stories to lead into my main thought today, that our viewpoints are shaped by our life experience. Human experience is so varied around the globe, and that's why we have such a range of opinions. If we look at another type of animal, say deer, just for an example, well, first of all, they don't really have the mental capacity to have conscious opinions. But even if they did, there probably wouldn't be a whole lot of difference among their opinions because their experience on Earth is so similar. They're just fighting for food and trying to not get eaten by wolves. Diversity of experience and thus diversity of opinion is a key component that differentiates human life from all other forms of life on Earth. And I think it's both a good and a bad thing. The range of human experiences and opinions on Earth has led to incredible innovations and progress that we've all benefited from, except maybe the Amish people. But on the other hand, I'm certain that all the war and political unrest that has plagued humanity for thousands of years is also at its core caused by difference of opinion. The crux of this dilemma is that in order for us to live in a free society, something that I think we all would agree is one of the most important things in life, there needs to be space for diversity of experience and thus opinions. There's not really any good way around this. If you start regulating things like experiences and opinions, then you very quickly get into a dictatorship. And history has very clearly shown us this multiple times. That's not a good thing. When I was traveling through Europe a few months back, I had a conversation that really solidified this concept of experience shaping opinion. I was talking to a tour guide named Jasmine in the city of Prague. Now, if you've listened to some of my previous episodes, then you probably remember me talking about her. Jasmine is an absolutely incredible woman. She's very well educated and an extremely passionate person, yet we did have some differences of opinion that became apparent as we discussed some deeper issues. I've always enjoyed tours that span an entire day because that really allows you to spend significant time with the tour guide and your group, and thus you get to know them beyond just the surface level stuff that I absolutely can't stand. The tour with Jasmine in Prague was a full day tour. I was also in a rather intimate group of only 5 other travelers. This is rare. It's usually a group of maybe 15 to 20 people. In this group, there was a recently divorced and very mild-mannered quality control associate from Boston, a friendly and very outgoing crane operator from Manchester, and a quiet software engineer from Toronto. After we sat down for lunch, our conversation wavered from the usual stuff that you might expect, and we got to talking about the lovely subject of politics. Amazing, right? We went around the table sharing anecdotes about our local communities and grievances about the current state of the world. Almost immediately, Jasmine shared that in response to her grievances, she was in favor of a universal basic income system. Now, I'll be quite blunt here. I've always thought that universal basic income is a terrible idea. But for the sake of not offending anyone, I kept my mouth shut during most of that conversation in Prague. I certainly didn't say what I just said now. In the coming days, as I continued to explore the Gothic architecture in Central Europe, I thought back to that conversation and I pondered how 2 people, myself and Jasmine, with similar levels of education and surprisingly similar interests could come to 2 vastly different economic conclusions about what the best system is. I thought back through my own life and experience. I've been extremely lucky as a young adult to be a part of 2 organizations that have heavily rewarded my efforts. Right out of high school, I received an athletic scholarship to the University of Tennessee. I started out school there on a partial scholarship, but after 2 years of development and continued contribution, my coaches upgraded me to a full ride because of the increased value that I brought to the team. For my last couple years of college, my education was totally paid for, and I actually pocketed a substantial amount of cash through living stipends that are typical with a full ride scholarship. More recently, I joined a company where my compensation is directly tied to my outputs. If I work harder and drive more results for the company, I make more money. These 2 very formative experiences have instilled in me this concept that inputs are directly tied to outputs. If you work harder and smarter, then you'll make more money. I think that any system that goes against this, like universal basic income, is inherently harmful to society because it undermines that work ethic of the populace. While I only spent a day or so with Jasmine, and thus I didn't really get to know her background intimately well, I imagine that she hasn't benefited from the luxury of being part of a merit-based system like I have. If someone hasn't had that incredibly rewarding and satisfying experience, then why wouldn't they want universal income for everyone that's not tied to input, right? In my estimation, if someone arrives to the conclusion that we should forsake a merit-based system, there's a couple things that might be going on. Number one, they're just plain lazy inherently. Number two, they maybe haven't discovered a passion that runs so deep that it drives them to work hard. Number three, they're just in the wrong type of system. And by system, I mean either a company or a country even. There's a reason why so many millions of people want to immigrate to the United States every single year. Well, it's certainly not a perfect country by any means. I'm definitely not saying that. It is backed by a system that rewards effort, and that's becoming less and less common in the world today. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, I think we've established that opinions are guided by experience, and with that in mind, we should take our life experiences with a grain of salt, remembering that our single life experience will never come close to representing the breadth of all human experience. Sometimes I find my opinions clashing very strongly with those around me. Maybe the things I've said in today's episode have clashed strongly with your views. It's in those moments that I try to remind myself that we haven't shared the same life, and thus our opinions will never be aligned. And that's okay. It's easy to become biased and see the world through colored glasses of our own experience, but that often is misaligned with reality. There's an old Middle Eastern story that really illustrates an interesting point along these lines. Many years ago in India, there were 6 blind men who all lived together. And this is a long time before anything like Social Security or disability pensions. So these men were struggling financially. Each day, the 6 of them would stand on the side of the road begging onlookers for money. They had heard of this legendary animal called an elephant, but obviously none of them had ever seen one since they were blind from birth, and they had no concept of what one actually looked like. One day, it turned out they were standing on the side of the road, like they always did, and a man leading an elephant stopped to speak with them. When he mentioned that he had an elephant with him, they all asked if they could touch it. They figured by feeling the elephant, they might be able to determine what one looked like without actually seeing it. The first man touched the elephant's side and figured that it looked like a wall. The second grabbed a tusk and thought, no, it was more like a spear. The third one grabbed its trunk and he ran off in a fit of fear, thinking that it was some type of dangerous snake. The fourth man grabbed a leg and thought, no, it looks more like a pillar. The fifth man felt an ear and concluded that elephants were like huge paper fans. Finally, the sixth man got a hold of the tail and understandably thought that elephants were like long pieces of rope. They got to talking amongst each other and shared their conclusions. They very quickly began to fight and yell, accusing each other of dishonesty. Eventually, another onlooker stopped by. He broke up the fight and he explained what elephants actually look like. He said that elephants have sides like walls, tusks like spears, trunks like snakes, legs like pillars, ears like paper fans, and tails like rope. So what's the takeaway from this silly little story? Well, it shows us that one subjective experience can be true, but that experience is very limited and it can't possibly account for all truth at the same time. Multiple conclusions can be true, but that's a hard concept for us to digest. It's human nature to claim objective truth based on our own experiences while also ignoring the experiences of other people. So with that in mind, we should be kind to others even if they don't align with our viewpoints, knowing that we're not always right, but we're also not always wrong. With that, I'm going to wrap things up today, how I always do, with a quote. Differences are healthy. There lies the scope of inquiry. In inquiry lies the scope for learning. Differences only turn unhealthy when we make them the cause for hatred. Thanks for listening.